Star Trek never resolved a fascinating conflict between Captain Picard and Sisko. Star Trek is full of iconic captains, but few have left a more lasting mark than Jean-Luc Picard and Benjamin Sisko. Both men defined the eras they commanded in, and both embodied very different philosophies when it came to leadership, morality, and the weight of duty. But what many fans often forget, or perhaps were never told, is that there's a powerful, unresolved tension between the two men, one that Star Trek planted early in Deep Space Nine and then, strangely, never truly revisited. Their relationship began with quiet, simmering hostility, and for good reason. The circumstances of their meeting were dramatic and tragic. But instead of letting that tension evolve over time, Star Trek left a tantalizing thread dangling. The lack of resolution between Picard and Sisko remains one of the franchise's most quietly fascinating missed opportunities. The Wolf 359 elephant in the room, the root of the conflict goes back to one of the most devastating events in Star Trek history, the Battle of Wolf 359. When the Borg invaded Federation space in Star Trek: The Next Generation, they assimilated Captain Picard and transformed him into Locutus, using his knowledge and authority to devastate Starfleet. The battle resulted in the destruction of 39 starships and over 11,000 lives. One of those ships was the USS Saratoga, and among its crew was Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Sisko. He survived, barely, but lost his wife, Jennifer, in the attack. Sisko's escape with his young son Jake was marked by grief and trauma, and his hatred of Locutus, and by extension, Picard, burned deep. This backstory was laid out in the Deep Space Nine pilot episode Emissary. When Sisko first meets Picard, he's cordial but ice-cold. His disdain is palpable. He reminds Picard exactly where they met before, at the site of his greatest tragedy. Picard is clearly uncomfortable, burdened by guilt, but too stoic to show it. Sisko doesn't hide his anger. In that moment, a compelling interpersonal conflict was born, one between two Starfleet legends with opposing energies, linked by war, loss, and guilt. And then, the show moved on. A conflict that deserved more. After Emissary, the tension between Sisko and Picard is never directly addressed again. Picard never returns to Deep Space Nine. Sisko never shows up in The Next Generation. In fact, the two never share another scene. For years, fans expected there would be a crossover, an episode that would explore their shared trauma, or at least allow them to confront what happened at Wolf 359. After all, Star Trek had already shown a willingness to deal with the emotional aftershocks of Borg encounters. Episodes like TNG's Family or Voyager's Scorpion proved that the writers understood the long-term consequences of assimilation and survival. So why didn't Picard and Sisko ever get the closure their story demanded? Some of the answer lies in the production side of things. Deep Space Nine was very deliberately meant to be its own show, with its own tone, away from the highly polished diplomacy of TNG. DS9 was grittier, more morally gray. By sidelining Picard after Emissary, the writers ensured that Sisko could stand as his own captain without being in Picard's shadow. But narratively, that decision left a narrative wound that never healed. Sisko began his arc as a man grappling with profound loss and hatred. His personal development over the next 7 seasons was remarkable, but none of it was ever contextualized by a direct reckoning with Picard, the man who, in Sisko's eyes, was partially responsible for his wife's death. Picard. The unspoken guilt. Picard's own relationship to the Borg and his time as Locutus is a well-documented source of inner torment. TNG explored it delicately in episodes like Family, where Picard breaks down in tears while visiting his brother's vineyard, and I, Borg, where he struggles to treat the Borg as anything more than monsters. But it's Emissary that provides one of the most striking examples of how others view Picard through the lens of Locutus, not as a victim, but as an unwilling perpetrator. Sisko doesn't see a man who suffered. He sees a man who took everything from him, no matter how unwillingly. That perception was never challenged on screen again. Picard was never shown wrestling with Sisko's judgment or attempting to earn his forgiveness. We never got to see how Picard would respond to a man who blamed him, reasonably, for a personal tragedy. And that's a shame, because it would have offered a deeper, more textured portrait of Picard than we ever got, even in Picard. Imagine the emotional weight of a scene where Sisko, now more spiritually evolved, confronts Picard not with anger, but with forgiveness. Or a scene where Picard, still bearing his own scars, tries to apologize not just to Starfleet, but to one of the individuals most personally affected by what he had become. It would have been powerful. It would have been real. And Star Trek never gave it to us. The mirror image of leadership. Another reason why the Picard/Sisko conflict feels so unfinished is because the two men represent fundamentally different models of command. Picard is the philosopher king, calm, reasoned, a diplomat. He often avoids violence unless there's no other option. His Enterprise is a ship of exploration where moral clarity and Federation ideals are paramount. Sisko, by contrast, is a wartime commander. He becomes the emissary of the prophets, a role that makes him both a religious icon and a strategic leader in the brutal Dominion War. He's willing to bend, even break rules, remember, in the pale moonlight, to protect the greater good. They are mirror images of Starfleet's dual identity, explorer versus soldier, philosopher versus pragmatist. If Star Trek had explored that conflict through their characters more directly, it could have revealed deep truths about the Federation itself. But it didn't. And again, that feels like a lost opportunity. Where could it have happened? There were several natural places in the Star Trek timeline where a follow-up to their tension could have taken place. TNG Season 7 could have included a crossover episode, especially since DS9 had already launched by then. Star Trek First Contact, where Picard's trauma with the Borg resurfaces, could have included a Sisko cameo or subplot given his history with them. DS9's later seasons, especially during the Dominion War, could have used a tactical consultation from Picard, giving them a chance to confront the past amid another war. Even Star Trek Picard, which heavily revisited Borg trauma, could have had Sisko referenced in some way, or shown Picard grappling more directly with his past as Locutus and how it affected individuals like Sisko. But none of those opportunities were seized. Legacy and fan theories. Over the years, the Picard/Sisko non-resolution has become a favorite topic for fan fiction and headcanon. Some believe Sisko eventually came to peace with Picard off-screen. Others suggest that Picard never forgot the encounter and avoided DS9 entirely because of it. There's also a theory that Sisko's arc as the emissary, his spiritual growth, his acceptance of fate, and his eventual transcendence allowed him to release his hatred. But again, that's something viewers have to infer. Star Trek never showed it. In that sense, the unresolved conflict has become part of the franchise's mythos, a shadow relationship that defines both men without them ever needing another encounter. The human cost of Star Trek's wars. Ultimately, what makes the lack of resolution between Picard and Sisko so haunting is that it touches on one of Star Trek's most important but often underexplored ideas, the human cost of Starfleet's decisions.